Dakota Territory, 1880. While neighbors raced to throw up quick log cabins before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Håkansson was still hauling wagon loads of fieldstone in late September. 40 tons of rock, they calculated. Over 100 days of backbreaking labor when he should have been breaking sod. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Lars wrapped his 16 by 20 log cabin in an 18-inch stone shell, double walls with an air gap between. He spent an entire season building what others dismissed as a stone barn around a perfectly good house. Then October 15th arrived. The blizzard hit without warning, bringing winds over 40 miles per hour and temperatures plunging toward 30 below zero. What would become known as the hard winter had begun. Standard log cabins burned through cord after cord of wood and still froze families inside. Ice formed on interior walls 3 feet from roaring fires. But that fool's stone-wrapped cabin? When Lars let his fire die completely during the worst 2-day storm, his house stayed above 40 degrees while neighbors' cabins dropped below freezing in hours. What did this Norwegian mason understand about heat, stone, and survival that generations of frontier builders had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Drop your city and state below. We love seeing where these frontier lessons reach today. Lars Håkansson pressed his bare palm against the inside wall of his log cabin on a January morning in 1879, and the frost-covered logs felt like touching ice. Outside, the Dakota wind howled at 10 below zero. Inside, despite a roaring fire in the sheet iron stove and 12 cords of oak burned since October, the interior temperature had dropped to 35 degrees overnight. Water in the wash basin had frozen solid. His wife Astrid pulled their 2-year-old son closer under every quilt they owned, her breath forming clouds in what was supposed to be their warm refuge. This was Lars's first winter in his conventional 16 by 20 foot cabin, built from 10-inch pine logs with simple mud and straw chinking. The structure followed the accepted frontier pattern. 7 courses of logs stacked and notched, gaps sealed with whatever clay and grass could be scraped together, and a single sheet iron stove positioned against the north wall. Every neighbor for miles had built essentially the same design, and every neighbor was burning through wood at the same alarming rate. But Lars had learned stonework as a young man in Norway, where 2-foot-thick fieldstone walls kept root cellars above freezing, and farmhouse kitchens comfortable even during coastal storms that brought weeks of freezing rain. He noticed things his neighbors missed. 2 hours after banking the fire each night, the cabin's interior temperature plummeted from 60 degrees to near freezing. The logs themselves, despite their thickness, offered little resistance to the prairie wind that found every gap in the chinking and drove cold air through the structure like water through a sieve. Heat from the stove warmed the air near the firebox, but that warmth vanished into the night sky almost as quickly as wood could be fed into the flames. Lars calculated they were losing most of their heat through the walls themselves, not just through gaps, but through the wood fibers that conducted cold from outside surfaces directly to interior air. In early spring, a trading trip along the Missouri River changed everything. Lars spent a night near a Mandan Earth Lodge, a structure that defied everything he thought he knew about frontier building. The lodge's central fire pit burned only a modest amount of wood, yet the interior stayed consistently in the 50s and 60s, even when outside air hovered well below freezing. The walls, built from a timber frame and packed with 2 to 3 feet of earth and sod, felt warm to the touch, hours after the fire had been reduced to glowing coals. An older Hidatsa man, watching Lars run his hands along the earthen interior, explained in broken English that deep walls drink the fire and give it back slow. That phrase lodged in Lars's mind like a splinter. He began to see his log cabin differently, not as a solid barrier against winter, but as a thin shell that absorbed heat briefly and surrendered it immediately. The native lodge worked because its massive earthen walls stored heat during the day and released it gradually through the night, creating a thermal battery that evened out temperature swings. Lars recalled Norwegian stone farmhouses where potatoes stored in 2-foot-thick masonry cellars never froze in winter and never spoiled in summer heat. The principle was identical. mass-absorbed energy and gave it back slowly. By late April, while neighbors focused on plowing and planting, Lars was sketching plans in the dirt beside his cabin. He would build a fieldstone shell around his existing log structure, creating a stone skin that could store heat and shield the original walls from wind. The design called for an 18-inch thick stone wall set 4 feet out from the existing cabin on all sides, creating a controlled airspace between old and new construction. The footprint would expand from 320 square feet to roughly 624 square feet, but most of that additional space would be filled with stone, not living area. Eli Thompson, his nearest neighbor, watched Lars pace off the enlarged foundation and shook his head. 40 to 50 tons of fieldstone, Eli calculated, hauling maybe 3 wagon loads per week from scattered pastures. Over 100 days of heavy labor between thaw and harvest, time that should be spent breaking additional sod or improving crop ground. Eli had built his own cabin in 3 weeks using accepted methods, 7 log walls, adequate chinking, and a good fireplace that had served his father's family through Wisconsin winters that reached 40 below. "Why build a stone house outside a log house?" he asked bluntly. "Pick one or the other." The criticism stung because it came from practical men whose survival depended on making sound decisions with limited time and resources. Thomas O'Donnell, another neighbor, pointed out that Lars's first winter had been hard on everyone. The solution wasn't exotic construction techniques borrowed from Indians and old country masons. The solution was cutting more firewood, improving the chinking, and accepting that frontier life meant cold mornings and frozen wash water. "A good 7-log wall was enough for my father at 40 below," O'Donnell said during a Sunday gathering at the schoolhouse. "No sense reinventing what already works." But Lars had kept careful notes that first winter, recording interior temperatures and wood consumption with the methodical habits of a trained craftsman. 12 cords of oak had barely kept the family comfortable, compared to period estimates that 10 cords should adequately heat tight rooms year-round with efficient stoves. More troubling, the cabin's overnight temperature loss, dropping 30 degrees in just 2 hours after the fire died, suggested fundamental problems with heat retention that more firewood couldn't solve. If another winter like the last one arrived, the cost in wood and family health would exceed whatever labor the stone shell demanded. Astrid watched her husband's growing obsession with quiet concern. The stonework would consume most of their second summer, delaying improvements that could increase crop yields and cash income. But she had also lived through that brutal first winter, had watched their son's lips turn blue in what should have been a heated home, had calculated how quickly their modest savings disappeared into cordwood purchased from better-prepared neighbors. When Lars announced his intention to begin hauling stone in June, she simply asked how much help he would need and whether the new walls could include proper windows that face south. Lars began the excavation on June 15, 1880, digging a trench 24 inches deep and 24 inches wide around his existing cabin. The new footprint extended 4 feet beyond the original log walls on all sides, creating space for an 18-inch stone shell with room for the crucial air gap that would separate old construction from new. He sloped the trench slightly to drain meltwater away from both foundations, following traditional Norwegian fieldstone practice that prioritized deep bases and positive drainage above all other considerations. Every few yards, Lars dug the trench 6 inches deeper and filled those pockets with smaller stones and gravel, creating a primitive French drain that would shed groundwater away from both the stone footing and the log sill plates. In Norway, he had seen century-old stone buildings fail not from frost or wind, but from water that pooled against foundations and froze, expanding with enough force to crack even the best-laid masonry. Dakota Territory offered plenty of spring snowmelt and summer thunderstorms that could destroy careless stonework within a few seasons. By early July, Lars and his teenage neighbor Peter began hauling fieldstone from scattered pastures and creek beds, loading each wagon with 1 to 1.5 tons of glacial granite and limestone that prairie ice had scattered across the landscape thousands of years earlier. 3 to 4 wagon loads per week, every week, with Peter earning 25 cents per day plus noon dinner for work that left both of them exhausted by evening. The stones ranged from fist-sized chunks suitable for hearting to massive foundation pieces that required both men and a pry bar to wrestle onto the wagon bed. Lars sorted the stones as methodically as a mason laying up a cathedral wall. The largest, flattest pieces would form the foundation course and corner quoins. Medium stones with at least one good face would build the outer and inner withes, the two parallel walls that would sandwich smaller rubble between them. The smallest fragments would pack the center cavity, creating a monolithic wall that could resist frost heave and store massive amounts of heat. By mid-August, 40 wagon loads of stone sat stacked beside the cabin in carefully arranged piles that neighbors had begun calling Lars's Quarry. The actual wall construction followed techniques Lars had learned during his apprenticeship with master stonemason Anders Nygaard. He built two separate faces, an outer withe and inner withe, with smaller stone hearting packed tightly between them. Every 2 to 3 feet of height, he set flat through stones that spanned from outer face to inner face, mechanically tying the wall together and preventing the two withes from separating under thermal stress or settling. The technique created a wall that behaved as a single structural unit rather than two independent shells that could shift and crack. For mortar, Lars burned limestone chunks in a small clamp kiln behind the cabin, producing quicklime that he slaked with creek water and mixed with sharp sand to create traditional lime mortar. But he used the mortar selectively, binding only the outer courses while leaving interior joints more open so moisture could migrate through the wall and escape rather than freezing inside the stone mass. This controlled permeability prevented the devastating freeze-thaw cycles that could destroy mortared walls in a single harsh winter. Managing the interface between old logs and new stone required careful planning that most neighbors dismissed as unnecessary complexity. Lars maintained a 4 to 6 inch air gap between the original log wall and the new stone shell, except at specific points where he bridged the gap with flat stones that would conduct heat from the logs into the masonry mass. Near the top of the stone wall, just under the eaves, he cut vent slots that allowed slow air circulation through the cavity, preventing moisture buildup while maintaining thermal connection between the two wall systems. At the base, Lars packed a 2-inch layer of dry earth mixed with straw between the log sill and stone foundation, creating both insulation and a fire break that would prevent flames from traveling between the structures. This detail reflected lessons learned from Norwegian coastal buildings, where salt air and driving rain demanded careful separation between different building materials that expanded and contracted at different rates. The south wall received special attention designed to capture winter solar gain. Lars left two 18 by 24-inch windows in the original log wall but built shallow stone sun pockets around them, recessed areas where morning and afternoon sun could warm the stone mass directly. Even on cold but sunny winter days, these stone surfaces would absorb radiant heat and release it slowly into the interior long after sunset. Construction of the north entry required the most sophisticated stonework. Lars built a 6-foot-long tunnel entrance that would function as a windlock, trapping cold air in the entry passage rather than allowing it to blow directly into the heated interior when the door opened. The technique echoed entrance designs used in Arctic pit houses and earth lodges, where long, low entry tunnels consistently kept frigid air from penetrating living spaces. Above the walls, Lars extended the existing roof eaves by 18 inches using hand-hewn oak outriggers, ensuring that rain and snowmelt would clear the new stone wall rather than pooling against the masonry surface. Poor drainage killed more stone buildings than structural failure, and Lars had seen too many Norwegian farmhouses undermined by inadequate roof overhangs that allowed decades of water infiltration to gradually destroy even the finest stonework. By late September, neighbors were counting days and shaking their heads. 110 working days that growing season, they calculated, spent hauling and laying stone instead of breaking additional prairie sod that could have produced 20 or 30 bushels of wheat per acre. At current grain prices, Lars had sacrificed at least $60 in potential crop income to wrap his cabin in what Eli Thompson was now calling the biggest root cellar in Dakota Territory. During a church gathering, Eli publicly listed the lost agricultural potential in precise figures. challenging Lars to explain how any amount of fuel savings could justify such an enormous investment of time and labor. Lars's response was simple and direct. He pointed out that the previous winter had cost him over $30 in purchased firewood alone, beyond the 12 cords he had cut himself. If the stone shell reduced his fuel consumption by even 1/3, it would pay for itself in saved wood costs within 3 winters. More importantly, he had kept detailed temperature records that proved his conventional cabin was simply inadequate for Dakota winters, regardless of how much wood he burned. The stone shell wasn't an agricultural experiment. It was a survival strategy based on engineering principles that had kept Norwegian families alive for centuries. The autumn of 1880 stretched warm and golden well into October, lulling settlers into dangerous complacency. Indian summer lingered through the first week of the month with temperatures reaching the 60s, and many homesteaders delayed their final preparations for winter. Eli Thompson postponed his last firewood cutting trip, confident that November would bring the usual gradual cooling that allowed time for final supply runs. Thomas O'Donnell decided against hauling an extra load of coal from the railroad depot, gambling that the mild weather would continue through Halloween. Lars, exhausted from his summer of stone hauling, but unable to shake his Norwegian grandfather's warnings about false autumn warmth, spent those deceptively pleasant October days cutting 10 cords of oak and hauling an additional 1,000 pounds of oats and flour from town. His neighbors watched him work with the grim satisfaction of men who believed they were witnessing obsessive behavior. The stone shell was complete. The cabin looked like a fortress, and still Lars prepared as if disaster was imminent. On October 15th, the weather turned with the sudden violence that characterized Great Plains storms. A wall of black clouds rolled in from the northwest, bringing winds that quickly climbed past 40 miles per hour and temperatures that plummeted 30 degrees in less than 6 hours. By evening, 3 feet of snow had fallen, driven horizontal by winds that created drifts 15 feet deep in cuts and around buildings. The telegraph lines went down first. Then the railroad tracks disappeared under snow that made travel impossible and resupply from eastern cities a distant hope. Within the first week, the scope of the crisis became clear. This was not a typical early winter storm that would blow through and allow normal activities to resume. The snow kept falling, the cold deepened, and no relief appeared on any horizon. Rail lines eastward remained completely blocked, cutting off coal shipments and grain deliveries that dozens of families had planned to purchase rather than stockpile. What would later be documented as the hard winter of 1880 to 81 had begun with a ferocity that caught even experienced frontiersmen completely unprepared. In standard log cabins throughout the region, families discovered the brutal mathematics of frontier heating. Interior temperatures swung wildly from 65 degrees near active fires to below freezing in distant corners and upstairs lofts. Ice formed on water pails within 10 feet of roaring fireplaces. Dirt floors froze solid, creating a thermal sink that drew heat from the air faster than most stoves could replace it. Families took to spending entire days in bed, sharing body heat under every quilt and blanket they owned, emerging only to feed fires that consumed alarming quantities of wood while providing minimal comfort. Most homesteaders had calculated their fuel needs based on previous winters and normal supply patterns. 8 to 10 cords of wood seemed adequate for families who could supplement with coal purchases or emergency buying from better prepared neighbors. But the hard winter demanded constant feeding of fires that burned a full wagon load of wood, roughly half a cord, every 3 to 4 days during the worst cold snaps. By late December, families who had considered themselves adequately prepared found themselves burning fence rails, furniture legs, and anything combustible they could find. Lars's stone-wrapped cabin performed with mechanical precision that amazed even him. When he loaded the central stove in the evening and brought interior air temperature to 70 degrees, both the logs and stone shell warmed to where interior wall surfaces felt comfortable to touch, around 60 degrees on the stone face. When he damped the fire for the night, the thermal mass released stored heat so gradually that interior temperatures dropped only 10 to 12 degrees by morning, even when outside air reached 15 below zero. More significantly, the cabin maintained usable heat distribution. In conventional log structures, Families crowded within 5 feet of active fires because temperatures dropped precipitously with distance from the heat source. But Lars's thermal mass system radiated stored energy from every wall surface, creating comfortable conditions throughout the entire 320 square foot interior. Even corners that would normally be frigid in log construction stayed within a few degrees of the room's average temperature. The fuel savings proved as dramatic as Lars had hoped. While neighbors burned through their planned wood supplies by January, Lars had consumed only about 5 cords by the same date, roughly a 40 to 50% reduction compared to similar-sized conventional cabins. More importantly, he could safely allow his fire to die completely for 6 to 8 hours without the interior temperature dropping below 40 degrees, giving him flexibility that desperate neighbors envied. By late January, the human cost of the hard winter was mounting. Several elderly settlers had succumbed to exposure and pneumonia in cabins that couldn't maintain adequate warmth despite burning every available stick of wood. Families were cannibalizing outbuildings, burning barn siding and fence posts in desperate attempts to stay warm. The social fabric of the scattered community began showing strain as better prepared homesteaders faced increasingly desperate requests for fuel sharing from neighbors who had miscalculated their needs. When Eli Thompson arrived at Lars's door on a howling February morning, his pride had been worn down by weeks of inadequate heat and shrinking wood supplies. His own family was burning furniture and had already dismantled their chicken coop for emergency fuel. His children were showing signs of cold-related illness, and his wife had developed a persistent cough that worsened in their perpetually chilled cabin. He needed enough wood to last until the next supply opportunity, but more than that, he needed to understand why Lars's cabin worked when conventional wisdom was failing so catastrophically. Lars faced a decision that would define both his relationship with his neighbors and the legacy of his unconventional building methods. He could share wood and provide temporary relief, or he could offer something more valuable and more dangerous, a practical demonstration of whether his thermal mass system could carry 2 families through the worst conditions with minimal fuel input. The test he proposed would either vindicate his methods completely or expose fatal flaws in his design when the stakes were highest. Lars made his decision on the evening of February 10th as winds outside reached an estimated 50 miles per hour, and the mercury thermometer nailed to his cabin wall showed 28 below zero. He would heat the stone shell to maximum capacity, then let the fire die completely and see whether stored thermal mass could keep 2 families comfortable for 48 hours without burning a single stick of additional wood. If the system failed, they would have enough reserve fuel to restart the fire and survive. If it succeeded, he would have proven that frontier building could transcend the brutal mathematics of wood consumption that was killing his neighbors. At 7 o'clock that evening, Lars loaded his central stove with 3 full armloads of seasoned oak, roughly 80 to 90 pounds of dense hardwood that represented a significant portion of his remaining fuel supply. He opened all stove drafts and fed the fire aggressively, bringing interior air temperature to 72 degrees, while warming the inner surface of his stone walls to approximately 65 degrees, warm enough that both families could comfortably lean against the masonry without discomfort. By 9 o'clock, the thermal battery was fully charged. Lars closed the stove drafts, sealed the firebox door, and recorded the time and temperature in his notebook with the methodical precision of a man whose life depended on accurate documentation. Outside, the storm had intensified to whiteout conditions with winds that drove snow horizontally and created drifts that climbed above the windowsills. The real test was beginning. 3 hours after the fire died, the results were already remarkable. Inside air temperature had dropped only 6 degrees to 66, while the stone surfaces still radiated. Gentle warmth at approximately 60 degrees. Eli Thompson's family, accustomed to cabins that lost 30 degrees in the first hour after fires went out, watched in amazement as the thick walls continued giving back stored heat. The children, who normally huddled under blankets within minutes of a dying fire, played comfortably on the floor in their regular clothes. By midnight, with outside temperatures plunging toward 30 below zero, the cabin's interior held steady at 62 degrees. The stone walls had cooled only slightly, maintaining surface temperatures around 58 degrees, still warm enough to provide radiant heating throughout the interior space. Most significantly, Even the corners and floor areas that would be frigid in conventional construction stayed within a few degrees of the room's average temperature, creating uniform comfort that defied everything both families thought they knew about winter heating. The first critical milestone came at 7 o'clock the following morning, exactly 10 hours after the fire had died. Interior air temperature measured 56 degrees, while outside conditions remained brutal at 25 below, with continuing high winds. The stone surfaces had cooled to approximately 52 degrees, but still provided noticeable radiant warming to anyone sitting near the walls. Both families had slept comfortably under normal bedding, without the multiple quilts and shared body heat that characterized survival in inadequately heated frontier cabins. As the first day progressed, the thermal mass continued its slow, steady release of stored energy. By noon, interior temperatures had stabilized around 54 degrees, a level that allowed normal activities without heavy winter clothing. The children played. The adults worked on indoor tasks like mending and food preparation, and conversation continued without the visible breath clouds that marked dangerously cold living conditions. Outside, the storm maintained its ferocity with sustained winds above 40 miles per hour and temperatures that never climbed above 20 below zero. The second night presented the ultimate test. 24 hours after the fire died, interior temperature had dropped to 50 degrees, while outside air held steady at 15 below, with occasional gusts that rattled the extended eaves Lars had built to protect his stone walls. The thermal mass still functioned, though more slowly, with stone surfaces maintaining temperatures around 48 degrees. Both families slept adequately, though they added extra blankets as a precaution against the gradually cooling interior. By the morning of the third day, 48 hours after Lars had sealed his stove, the experiment reached its planned conclusion. Interior air temperature measured 42 degrees, while outside conditions remained at 10 below zero with continuing snow and wind. The stone walls had cooled to approximately 40 degrees, but still provided enough residual heating to keep the cabin's interior above the freezing point that would have meant disaster for water supplies, food storage, and human comfort. The contrast with conventional heating became starkly apparent when Lars and Eli walked through the blizzard to check Eli's abandoned cabin. With its fire dead for 2 days, the interior temperature had dropped to 18 degrees, barely above the outside air temperature and well into the range that would kill vulnerable family members within hours. Ice had formed on interior walls, water containers had frozen solid, and the entire structure had become uninhabitable without immediate and massive fuel input. Eli Thompson stood in his frozen cabin and performed mental calculations that would reshape his understanding of frontier construction. Lars's thermal mass system had kept 8 people comfortably housed for 2 full days, using less wood than Eli typically burned in 6 hours during cold snaps. More importantly, the stone shell had provided steady, even heating that eliminated the dangerous temperature variations that made conventional log cabins death traps for children, elderly family members, and anyone weakened by illness or inadequate nutrition. When they returned to the stone-wrapped cabin, Lars finally restarted his fire, bringing interior temperatures back to the 70s within hours as the thermal mass eagerly absorbed and redistributed new heat input. But the demonstration was complete, and its implications were undeniable. 48 hours without fuel, in conditions that killed livestock and threatened human life throughout the region, and 2 families had remained not just alive but genuinely comfortable in a 320 square foot space heated entirely by energy stored in fieldstone walls. The mathematics of survival had been permanently altered. What neighbors had mocked as Lars's rock barn had proven itself a precisely engineered thermal battery that could outlast the worst weather the Great Plains could deliver while consuming a fraction of the fuel that conventional wisdom demanded. When spring finally arrived in April 1881, the devastation across Dakota Territory told the full story of the hard winter's impact. Rail lines remained blocked by massive ice jams and washed-out bridges, where snow melt had created unprecedented flooding. Whole stretches of the Missouri River had changed course, leaving former landing sites stranded miles from navigable water. Towns that had seemed permanently established the previous autumn were now collections of abandoned buildings and scattered debris. The human toll had been equally severe. Several homesteads stood empty, their owners having either perished during the worst cold or abandoned their claims when fuel supplies ran out and survival became impossible. Livestock losses reached catastrophic levels throughout the region, with some ranchers losing entire herds to exposure and starvation. Fences had been systematically dismantled and burned, outbuildings cannibalized for emergency fuel, and even church pews sacrificed to keep families alive during the coldest weeks of February and March. Lars surveyed his own situation with quiet satisfaction. 3 to 4 cords of oak remained neatly stacked in his woodshed, untouched reserves that represented security his neighbors could barely comprehend. His livestock had survived in a stone-lined shelter he had built using the same thermal mass principles as his cabin, maintaining above-freezing temperatures that kept water from freezing and animals from succumbing to exposure. Most importantly, his family had remained healthy throughout the winter that had brought pneumonia, frostbite, and cold-related deaths to families in conventional log structures. The response from his neighbors evolved slowly from embarrassment to practical curiosity. Nobody offered apologies or admitted error, but the questions began almost immediately. How deep had he actually dug the stone footing? How far had he kept the rock walls separated from the original logs? How many wagon loads of stone had the project really required? And where had he found the best building material? The inquiries came quietly, often during chance encounters at the general store or after church services, posed by men who could not afford to appear foolish but desperately needed solutions for the next winter. Within 2 years, evidence of grudging acceptance appeared throughout the scattered community. Thomas O'Donnell added a fieldstone wind wall around the north and west sides of his cabin, using the prevailing wind patterns to determine where thermal mass would provide maximum protection. Another neighbor built a stone half-basement and wrapped only the lower 4 feet of his existing log walls, creating a compromise system that required less labor while still providing significant thermal improvement. The most ambitious convert constructed an attached stone kitchen and pantry on his cabin's north side, using the new structure to shelter the main living space from the worst weather while adding valuable storage and work areas. Word of the Norwegian rockshell house spread through informal networks that connected isolated homesteaders across hundreds of square miles. A county newspaper published a brief item about the unusual cabin that had used half the wood of conventional structures during the hard winter, noting the specific fuel savings without endorsing or condemning the construction method. A traveling circuit preacher mentioned Lars's thermal mass system in letters that eventually reached church publications in Minnesota and Wisconsin, creating a small but documented trail of information that would survive in regional archives. Most importantly, the practical innovations continued evolving as other builders adapted Lars's core insights to their own situations and resources. Some homesteaders built stone-lined root cellars that doubled as emergency shelters, creating warm retreats that could house entire families during the worst storms. Others constructed hybrid systems that combined earth berming with fieldstone walls, using the natural thermal properties of both materials to create structures that required minimal heating fuel while providing year-round comfort. Lars himself became an informal consultant, visiting building sites and offering advice on foundation depth, stone selection, and thermal bridging techniques. He never charged for these consultations, viewing them as community service that improved everyone's chances of surviving future severe winters. His recommendations were invariably conservative, emphasizing proven techniques over experimental methods, and encouraging builders to err on the side of overbuilding rather than cutting corners that might fail under extreme conditions. The long-term vindication came through decades of reliable performance that quietly influenced regional building practices. Lars's stone shell remained intact and effective as interior fashions changed, and later owners added board siding over the log walls without realizing they were covering a sophisticated thermal mass system. When preservation-minded descendants inherited the structure in the mid-20th century, they discovered construction details that anticipated modern passive solar design by several generations. Building science eventually provided theoretical frameworks for what Lars had achieved through practical observation and old-world craftsmanship. Researchers studying earth-sheltered homes and revived interest in Native American building techniques confirmed that massive walls could maintain interior temperatures around 55 to 60 degrees, even in harsh climates with minimal fuel input. The principles of thermal mass, radiant heating, and controlled air infiltration that governed modern energy-efficient construction were identical to the techniques Lars had developed using nothing but fieldstone, lime mortar, and stubborn determination to build for the worst winter rather than the average one. Contemporary stone veneer and log home manufacturers began marketing systems that echoed Lars's innovations, advertising stone-clad log walls and insulated mass construction as cutting-edge approaches to residential heating efficiency. But the marketing materials rarely acknowledged that these techniques had been field-tested on the Dakota frontier by Norwegian immigrants who understood that survival depended on building methods that could outlast both skeptical neighbors and killing weather. On the frontier, the difference between life and death often came down to preparation that others called excessive until crisis proved it barely adequate. The man willing to be called a fool, who wrapped his wood in stone the way the land and the ancient peoples already knew, was the one whose grandchildren inherited warm houses and stories of ancestors who had understood that good enough was never good enough when winter forgot to end.